Current. I'm Clive Priddle. I am joined today by Harriet Washington. Harriet Washington is a medical ethicist researching at Harvard. She's the author of many books. The one that we are going to talk about today particularly is A Terrible Thing to Waste, which is newly available in paperback this month, August. But possibly we'll talk about some of your previous work too, if we may, Harriet, including your National Critics Circle Award winner, Medical Apartheid. Welcome to The Current.
Thank you so much, Clive. I'm thrilled to be here and eager to talk about both books.
Great. The subtitle of your new book is Environmental Racism and Its Assault on the American Mind. And I thought what we might do is start off by looking at both halves of that subtitle. When you think of an example of environmental racism, what springs to your mind? Can you give us a very particular visual idea of what you're seeing as an example of environmental racism?
The example that springs to most people's mind is lead. Because of the publicity of what's happened in Flint, Michigan, and Pittsburgh, and Baltimore and New York before then, most Americans have some idea that lead is prevalent in some communities and causing a lot of harm. But frankly, when I think of environmental racism, I think of air pollution. I find it a perfect example because it not only embodies the power, the potential to harm both body and mind, but also it sort of capsulizes the mysterious nature of it because, we all breathe the same air, or so we like to think. But science tells us that's not true. And air pollution is actually probably the worst contaminant because it's so versatile. University of Michigan tied it to heart disease and kidney disease. I've been following this for a long time, and frankly, I would not have associated air pollution with kidney disease. So these are very versatile poisons, and most people who are exposed to them heavily are exposed to more than one. So we've got an additive or synergistic effect. And I think there's been a lot of attention to the physical harms, like, lung cancer, et cetera, but very little attention to the cognitive harms. They're eroding our minds as well as our bodies.
Air pollution is one of those things that feels like it affects everybody who is in the vicinity of the air pollution pretty much evenly. And I happen to be talking to you from my home, which is near the George Washington Bridge, which used to be a terrible place of air pollution until the lead came out of gasoline. Mm-hmm. But your book is very specifically alleging racism. You're saying that not all communities are affected equally by these perils. So explain to me how this is a question of race as well as environmental pollution.
Yes, I'm not saying this. The data are telling us this. And the reason why it's race rather than economics is really interesting because it's often portrayed as a socioeconomic exposures and problems. We often hear language, even in the medical literature, alluding to how poor people are disproportionately affected and how lower income people. And that's true, they are. However, race is such a large risk factor that it overshadows socioeconomics. When you look at the data, which have been slow to come, but they are here now, a great deal of them, what you find is that it's not that the nature of the poisons are different from community to community, it's the concentration. At one time, 9 out of 10 bus depots in New York City were located in Harlem. So obviously their exposures are going to be greater. And that is something you see across the country. Fence line communities where you have residential communities that are abutting factory complexes. These aren't everywhere. When you look at these areas, these are where people of color live. When you look at Cancer Alley in Louisiana, high proportion of people of color. So I think the datum that best capitalizes for me, and I think most listeners, is that if you look at the exposure of Americans to air pollution, you find that African Americans who earn $50,000 to $60,000 a year, solidly middle class, have far more exposure than profoundly poor whites who earn $10,000 a year. So again, it's not that economics is not a risk factor, but it's overshadowed by race.
That is an extraordinary statistic because a white person earning $10,000 a year would consider themselves to be poor, I think, in this country.
Profoundly poor, yeah.
Yeah. And yet you're saying that a solidly middle class income black individual or family is likely to find themselves in a more environmentally degraded place than that very poor white person.
That is exactly what the data tell us. And it has to do with many narratives that have not been told about exposure to environment. When I think back to the 70s and 80s, I remember a lot of publicity about places like Love Canal, where
Yep.
people were afraid that they were exposed to really potent toxins. But we didn't hear about other exposures that were happening at the same time that were much, much greater. We didn't hear about Anniston, Alabama, where you had Olin, Monsanto, Solutia, and the U.S. Army all contributing potent toxins that affected people there. They were the water was so poisoned that when university researchers went to test it, and one of the tests would be dunking fish into the water for 5 minutes to see how the water affected them. They said it was like a horror movie. They dunked the fish in the water for 5 minutes, and the fish came out dead. You know, so but we didn't hear about these. We heard about others. We heard about other communities, and I think that's why it had to wait for scientists to collect the data and tell us that it was these middle class communities who were often bearing the brunt, despite the common language about poor communities, low income communities. It's not constrained to poor people. If you go to Houston, where there are not zoning laws to protect people from industrial exposure, you find that the most horrific exposures happen in middle class communities in Houston. If they had not been African Americans, there's nothing about this community that would signal that they'd be exposed to pollution. So it's a problem throughout the country, unfortunately.
Let's go back to Harlem just momentarily, only because it's part of New York that I happen to know quite well. I pass through it regularly. I'm curious, going back to your example of the buses. So do you think that was an example of the city saying, okay, we're just going to dump our bus depots in black neighborhoods? Or at the time, was it the city saying, actually the ridership on the buses is predominantly black Americans, and therefore it makes sense to have a larger concentration of bus depots in the parts of the city where they are going to be most heavily used? In other words, I'm guessing what I'm asking you is, did this happen as a matter of negligence, ignorance, or deliberate racism?
Well, the honest answer is I don't care.
Right.
I don't care, because when you ask that question, and it's a very frequently asked question, I hear it all the time, that reflects concerns of people who are not poisoned. The question, is this really intent? Does it mean that we are evil, venal people who are subjecting people of color to this? But for people who are poisoned, it really doesn't matter. The reality is they bear the brunt of this environmental assault. They have not been protected by the EPA and government. In fact, the EPA has sometimes, participated in their exposure. And that's what's important to me. The fact that people are being subjected to it. And the other reason why I say I don't care is I'm going to admit to something I rarely admit to, a little bit of bitterness. Because what I learned in researching this book was that from the beginning, people who brought lawsuits demanding that environments where people of color were being poisoned be cleaned up and the people be helped were often stymied by the courts, who would say to them, okay, you have demonstrated that these people have been subjected to environmental toxicity disproportionately and unfairly, but you haven't demonstrated that it's because of racism. You have to prove to us that it was a racist sentiment that caused it. And I thought, what? I'm no lawyer, but that sounds completely absurd. Why should that be the criterion on which a remedy is based? And yet it's a very prevalent mentality. I first read about it in the case of Afton, North Carolina, where people protested, the black people who lived in the area and whites who lived nearby them and were supporting them, protested for 6 weeks and were going to jail. And basically, that's what they were told. You have to prove that it was the intent of industry and government to subject you to disproportionate poisoning. And that should not be the case. That should not be a consideration.
I feel very well put in my place. But yes.
Not my intention at all. Like I said,
No,
it's a very frequently asked question, you know.
So what is sort of truly horrific here is the picture that you're presenting is that if the injustice is presented as a matter of race, it tends to be overlooked. And if it's presented not as a matter of race, it tends to be legally ignored. So how on earth can you solve this problem of degraded environments that are poisoning people, largely people of color? How do you get that fixed?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. I really do. But I do have some ideas. You know, it reminds me a great deal of the civil rights movement. I was, I witnessed it, and my parents adamantly refused to let me go on any marches, etc. But I witnessed it, and one of the things I came away believing, and I still believe, is that it would not have been successful when it was had there not been whites to support the Black people who were demanding justice and demanding fair treatment. Part of it's ugly mathematics. We're what, 13.3% of the US population? Frankly, there may not be enough of us to have, the desired effect on our own. And more importantly, when whites lent their support, they lent more than the support of people the government actually cared about. They lent also a moral authority to it. And I'm seeing that happen again now, not just in Black Lives Matter protests, but also in the environmental movement. There are environmental groups that some people refer to, and I don't like this terminology. I welcome suggestions for better terminology. They're called recreational environmental groups. Places like, the Sierra Club. Places that are devoted to maintaining the wild, not only for scientific and social reasons, but also because we need wild, we need green spaces. Okay, their mission has always been very different from the mission of people of color who are just trying to stay alive. They're just trying not to be poisoned. They're trying not to have their children's brains eroded by lead. So, but there's been a coming together over the past decade that is very powerful and I think very important. In, I think, 2015, Aaron Mayer was elected the first African-American president of the Sierra Club. They began giving awards in the name of Robert Bullard, who's called the father of environmental racism. They are beginning to embrace this subject as important to them. And so I think that's what's going to have to happen. Just as with civil rights, we're going to need white allies. We're going to need people who are not directly affected the way we are, but have them take the moral stance and turn it into political capital and support us. And that's what gives me hope. Because frankly, when I look at what has been accomplished with African Americans who have worked really hard, been very smart, very effective, I think of Robert Bullard and his wife, a lawyer, who brought the first lawsuits. The lawsuits were brilliantly executed, but they got that response I already told you about. Well, you haven't proved it's racism, So I think that that will be the turning point. At least I hope so. So that's what gives me optimism.
Now, your book was published in hardcover in 2019 in the summer. Paperback is just out now. So in a way, it came before the coronavirus experience. And I'm imagining that the paperback really doesn't talk that much about coronavirus, that you were probably putting that to bed before we had a full sense of the coronavirus.
Actually, I wrote a preface on the coronavirus for the paperback.
Okay, my bad.
Yeah.
So tell me.
I shoehorned it in there.
Okay. Tell me if you think that our understanding of a public health emergency, which is what coronavirus has visited on the entire country, everywhere now has had to deal with this, all communities. Does that give you any hope that maybe perhaps we are all more willing to think about shared health emergencies now, and that there might be a greater support generally for the argument that environmental racism absolutely exists and absolutely is a priority for everyone?
I think so, in part because I wrote an article for Nature in which I tied environmental racism directly to coronavirus 19. One of the things I pointed out, which had not been pointed out in the medical literature before then, was that every single risk factor for coronavirus 19 is caused by environmental racism. I'm not suggesting that it is the only cause. It's obviously not true. But I am saying that we're looking at higher rates among people of color. We're looking at higher rates among people who are exposed to environmental racism, and there's not a single risk factor from kidney disease to immunosuppression to diabetes that is not caused or exacerbated by environmental contaminants. So there's actually a synergy here that's very important. And if we care, and I believe that we do, I'm quite certain that public health officials do, if we care about reducing the rates and also about contending with the next outbreak of the next emerging disease, then it's going to be really important to understand the role of environmental toxicity in creating a vulnerability here. And so I use that message, but I also added to the preface of the book not only the fact that environmental racism was a risk factor, a very important risk factor, but also that the violence associated with there's an interesting relation between violence and infection. And there's been a lot of exploration of that. But one of the things we're seeing in the pandemic is a lot of xenophobia, a lot of violence and aggression toward people that we regard as other. Remember how early on Asians were being targeted? And idiots would assume any Asian person was Chinese, or they said so. But the attacks escalated frighteningly. At first, they were harassing people. But it wasn't long before we were having 100 people a day of Asian extraction, or who looked Asian, being assaulted, and it was physical assaults. One man stabbed a whole family of Asians in a store. They were being sent to the hospital. And finally, then it spread to African Americans. So, even though I think that very often people feel a pull, they are naturally being torn between consideration of the pandemic, consideration of the xenophobia that we're suffering, environmental toxicity. I think that they're all related. And I think it's really important to trace those relations so people will understand that attacking one is attacking all of them. And the answer to our better health has to do with attention on more fronts, not fewer.
The reason I wanted us to talk a little bit about your early award-winning book on medical apartheid is because it's a sort of terrifying counterpoint to what you're talking about now. On the one hand, Black Americans are used as a community for medical experimentation, and on the other hand, some of the information that we should have been drawing about those communities and the environment in which they were living and being adversely affected by, we ignored. Really an extraordinary journey between those two places that you chart in your work. I know I'm oversimplifying here because these are two books with a great deal of material and a great deal of story in them. But
I agree with the parallel you drew. I agree with that.
I mean, it must make you want to bang your head against a wall sometimes.
I'm actually the perfect person to do this. Because, I mean, I feel more like a detective. I get excited when I find a new, outrage. So, yeah. Well, my pathology is medical history's gain, I guess.
I just really want to salute the work that you have been doing for a very long time and the way in which you've managed to join the dots for us, even if it tells a pretty grim story for those of us who are in some ways, whether actively or passively complicit in it. And I really do think it's an eye-opening way of looking at the next challenge that we're going to face in America, which is sort of the cleanup after COVID, isn't it? Is how do we recover from that? Now, let's try and leave on a sort of slightly upbeat note. Is there a way in which, from your perspective, recovering from coronavirus can be done right across all communities in the US and of course elsewhere too? I mean, I'm not forgetting that you've studied other parts of the world, but let's just try and fix the home front to begin with. Can we do this right?
Well, my crystal ball is not actually functioning, but I'm going to tell you what my hopes are. And I think it's important and sad, but it's important to remember we're not out of the woods yet. You
Right.
know, hopefully, I have every expectation we will be, but this should be the most sober wake-up call that we need in order to do things differently. And it's important to realize that infectious disease is going to come at us. The emerging diseases are coming steadily. It's not the first one we encountered, but we have failed to apply the lessons we should have learned. We had to deal with HIV disease. We had to deal with Ebola, hepatitis C, a whole slew of neglected tropical diseases that are now on our shores. And unfortunately, what we should have done is methodically set up processes for collecting data so we know where we are early on. And we haven't done that. I think we have to make absolutely sure that we do it this time. This should be the last time we have failed to prepare by collecting good data from the very beginning. Then we will know right away that African Americans and Native Americans and Pakistani people are at higher risk. Then we would know right away about certain aspects of vulnerability. So we have to do that next time. And then we also have to bolster our existing public health system. One of the reasons why we have people who are, one of the many reasons why we have people who are dying disproportionately is that we were completely unprepared in other ways. With our resources, our wealthy country, there is no reason why we should not have had ample supplies of protective gear. No reason why doctors and nurses should have gone begging. I have a friend who's a doctor who sent me an email begging for face masks. As it happened, I had a few hundred, forgotten sitting around in my bathroom I could send off. That should never happen in this country. I can see it happening in a poor developing country, but not here. So anyway, we have to use I think my favorite aphorism, some would say cliche, but let's be generous, call it an aphorism, is when you lose, don't lose the lesson. In terms of managing this pandemic the way we should have, we've definitely lost, no matter how things come out. But we have to remember next time we need to prepare, and we need to make sure that we don't have vast swathes of people in this country who have no doctor, who have no health insurance, who have no access to health care. So even if they get to a hospital or get to a medical center, they're less likely to get appropriate care. So there are a lot of things that we can do by determining to do correctly next time all the things that we did incorrectly this time.
Well, listen, I really want to thank you. I want to thank you for joining us today on The Current. I want to thank you for the work that you've been doing, and I want to thank you for the lesson. I hope we will help in a small way for that lesson not to be lost. And really, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure on my part, too. Thank you so much.
Hachette,